He told me how he followed her through the leaves. Right before he smiled and asked if I thought he was getting better, I'm Dr. Linda Morell. And as I sit here now, 17 years later, there's a single memory that still chills me to the bone. It wasn't the first time I'd watched someone unfold their pain, but it was the day I realized I'd been sitting across from a predator. I'll never forget that moment. The late afternoon light slanting through my office blinds, casting long stripes across the carpet, and him, Senator Andrew Blake, leaning forward, voice so calm, eyes shining with something I refused to name. You know, they all said he was broken, battling depression after his tours in the Gulf. Everyone believed a decorated war hero, a devoted family man, a shining political star, could only be struggling with ghosts of combat. But there was something in the way he described those nights, speaking as though he were a mere narrator to someone else's horror. And in that instant, a question hit me harder than any clinical test result. What if those stories weren't dreams or metaphors, but confessions? Just before I continue, if you find this story gripping, if you feel that electric jolt of curiosity, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and I need to know who's really listening as we peel back the layers of truth and denial. I was 50 then, running a private practice in Alexandria, Virginia, less than an hour from the halls of power. I specialized in depression and narcissistic disorders, guiding Washington's elite through their darkest nights. In all my years, I'd learned to hold my emotions in check, coldly analytical, reassured by the boundaries of professional ethics. Yet here I was, heart pounding, mind racing with clinical hypotheses. Dissociation, PTSD flashbacks, even pathological lying. Nothing in my training prepared me for the possibility that what I thought were fantasies were cold, calculated recollections of real violence. That afternoon, he narrated a scene in the park. He followed her through the leaves, he said, voice steady, watched her boots crunch, and when she finally screamed, he didn't flinch. He spoke in the third person as though distancing himself, but I sensed the intimacy of his words. The cadence of his descriptions, the precise dates, the exact locations, Detroit, October 14, 2003, details that no mere patient fabricates for attention. I remember forcing a neutral response. Tell me more about how you felt, even as my stomach knotted. In my notes, I jotted fantasy, metaphor, safe expression. I didn't want to believe that a man the public adored could be capable of such cruelty. I paused, offered a measured nod, then calmly reached for my pen. You know, Andrew, sometimes our subconscious uses stories to help us process trauma, I said. But the truth? My professional detachment cracked for a moment. Behind his composed facade, I saw satisfaction, maybe even amusement, that I'd been fooled. And that realization stung worse than any traumatic memory I'd ever treated. By the time the session ended, my mind was a tempest of doubt. If I spoke up, I risked shattering a man's life without concrete proof. If I stayed silent, I became complicit. So I did what nothing in my training suggested. I destroyed the journals, erased the tapes, and closed my practice. I told myself it was the only way to live with the guilt of uncertainty. But every time I heard a news report of another unresolved disappearance, I felt the weight of that decision, still do. Now, at 75, retired and removed from the glare of politics, I finally speak the truth. Not for justice, but for anyone who's ever doubted their own intuition. Because sometimes the monsters don't lurk in nightmares. They sit across from you in plush chairs, wearing a smile. And if someone tells you what they are, believe them. So tell me, have you ever brushed off a warning sign only to regret it later? Let me know in the comments, because your silence could one day cost someone their life. I grew up in a small mill town in New Hampshire, where everyone knew your name and your business by the time you reached middle school. My father worked the day shift at the paper mill, my mother taught middle school history, And I learned early that people carry stories inside them, some beautiful, some painful. By the time I entered college at Dartmouth, I knew I wanted to understand those stories, to help people navigate their inner landscapes. I majored in psychology, then went on to earn my doctorate at Harvard Medical School's Department of Psychiatry. I moved to Alexandria, Virginia in 1998, drawn by its blend of historic charm and proximity to Washington, D.C. I opened my private practice in a brownstone near King Street, furnished it with plush chairs and a walnut desk, and filled my walls with art that whispered calm. From the beginning, I specialized in treating depression and narcissistic personality disorders, often under the weight of political stress. You know, it wasn't exactly a cushy suburban clinic. I'd have mornings full of congressional aides, afternoons with lobbyists, and evenings devoted to veterans struggling to reconcile what they'd seen overseas. My days followed a steady rhythm: a quick espresso in the kitchen, a stack of files reviewed before the first session, then hour-long appointments back-to-back until sunset. Between clients, I'd consult journals, attend seminars on trauma-informed care, and supervise younger clinicians, always reminding them that bedside manner and professional boundaries aren't mutually exclusive. To be honest, I thrived on the intellectual challenge of diagnosing complex cases and mapping out treatment plans. My colleagues called me clinical and detached, and I wore those labels like badges of honor, until they weren't enough to protect me from the truth I'd eventually face. My practice was a microcosm of Washington's elite: veterans with medals still pinned to their lapels, rising politicians polished for the cameras, spouses of CEOs who paid for discretion. I watched people arrive with carefully rehearsed stories, only to drop their guard once we'd shared a few sessions. I learned to listen for the subtext, the hesitation before certain words, the flash of emotion behind practiced smiles. I kept meticulous notes, coded my audio recordings for voice patterns, and never missed a supervision meeting. Every Thursday afternoon, I'd drive down King Street past the trolley tracks, windows rolled down so I could smell the popcorn from the old movie theatre, and remind myself why I chose this work: to bear witness, to guide, to heal. Yet, even in that bustling, ivy-lined neighborhood of cafes and antique shops, I retained an analytical coolness, my shield against becoming entangled in a client's chaos. That shield held firm for years, until I encountered Senator Andrew Blake and realized that listening alone wouldn't save me from what I refused to believe. Now, when I look back at my life in Alexandria, at those polished floors, the late-night medical journals, the hush of my office as dusk fell, I see more than memories. I see the subtle signs I missed, the instincts I silenced, and the lessons I carry with me every day. Trust what you hear, trust what you feel, and never underestimate the darkness someone might hide behind a practiced smile. It was a crisp October evening in 2008 when the hairs on the back of my neck first prickled, although I didn't know why at the time. My office on Duke Street was quiet by 6 o'clock. The last leaf-colored rays of sunlight filtering through the plantation shutters, dust motes dancing in the amber glow. Across from me sat Sarah, my part-time receptionist, folding the day's appointment slips and humming softly as she prepared to lock the front door. Behind her, Dr. Patel, an intern I'd taken under my wing, glanced nervously at his watch, ready to leave for a family dinner. I leaned back in my leather chair, unclasped my pen, and checked the notes from my last session with Senator Andrew Blake. Detailed observations about his mood shifts, his polished rhetoric, the ever-present glint in his eyes whenever he recounted those nightmares. Outside, the roar of traffic faded into the hush of the historic district, and for a moment, I felt the familiar calm of routine settle over me. That calm shattered the instant the door clicked open and Andrew strolled in, his tailored suit impeccable, the faintest trace of cologne in the air, an aroma I knew too well from our weekly meetings. He offered me that practiced, reassuring smile, the one that made everyone from constituents to press photographers believe in his integrity. Yet when he settled into the chair opposite mine, his posture shifted, shoulders tensed, fingers drumming the armrest, as though he were preparing to unload something heavy. I greeted him with a soft, professional tone. "Good evening, Andrew. How have you been since last week?" But my heart pounded with the inexplicable sense that tonight would be different. Dr. Patel hovered by the door, clipboard in hand, ready to observe but unprepared for what was coming. Sarah peered around the corner, curiosity in her eyes, as if she sensed the undercurrent of tension too. Andrew cleared his throat and began in that familiar, calm voice, betraying no emotion until he hit the words that made my blood run cold. "I want to tell you about another night." Instantly, the room felt smaller, stifling, as I braced myself for the narrative I'd heard before, but never quite like this. He described a suburban street lined with sycamores, the crunch of leaves underfoot, a girl running, her breath ragged, her screams swallowed by darkness. Only tonight, the details were sharper. He mentioned the model of her boots, the exact number of steps it took him to catch up, the way the street lamp flickered just as he raised his hand. I forced myself to remain calm, to remind myself that in our profession, everything is data until proven otherwise. But the sight of Patel's pale face and the way Sarah inched closer made it impossible to ignore the charge in the air. This was no clinical exercise. This was an admission. My pulse thundered in my ears as Andrew leaned forward, eyes glinting, and whispered, "You know what I mean, don't you?" In that moment, I realized the trigger had arrived. Everything I'd pretended to doubt was about to crash into my reality. And as I reached for my notebook, pen poised, I understood that tonight's session would redefine my life forever. Because the person I was about to confront was not a patient in need of therapy, but a predator unmasked by his own words. Everything I thought I understood about Andrew Blake's sessions unraveled in that moment, and I realized I was no longer in control of the narrative. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my office with a knot in my stomach, so tight I could hardly breathe. I reviewed my notes obsessively, searching for patterns I'd missed, any sign that those clinical observations could have been screams for help or blatant confessions. But each entry read like someone describing a pathology in another person. Dates, locations, meticulous detail. The first unexpected turn came when I reached out to a trusted colleague, Dr. Hayes, for a second opinion. I spoke to him in hushed tones over the phone, careful not to mention names. "I'm concerned about possible homicidal ideation," I said, my voice shaky. He urged me to consult the legal department at my professional board and to consider breaching confidentiality if I believed someone was in imminent danger. My fingers hovered over the email draft to the board, but I deleted it. The weight of that choice settled on me like a stone. Report a sitting senator and risk collapsing a career built on discretion, or stay silent and live with the knowledge that I might have enabled a killer. Then came the next complication. The senator's behavior shifted subtly, but unmistakably. He began arriving late, first by a few minutes, then by half an hour, breathing heavily, as though racing from somewhere. He'd glance at the door before sitting, muscles coiled, but when I asked if something was wrong, he'd offer only a terse apology and a half smile. One afternoon, he brought flowers, white roses, instead of his usual calm entrance. He placed them on my desk without a word, leaned back, and for a moment I thought he was going to open up, to admit everything. But instead he said, "I thought you should have something beautiful today." My professional instincts screamed that this was manipulative, a test of my empathy, but I couldn't dismiss the gesture's sincerity entirely. I tucked the roses into a glass vase, my hand trembling as he watched. The session ended with him saying, "Thank you for listening," but I felt like I'd walked deeper into a trap. A week later, I discovered a voicemail from Sarah, my receptionist. Her voice quavered, "Doctor, Morell, the police were here asking questions about a missing student from Detroit. They want to know if Senator Blake ever mentioned anything to you." My chest tightened as I listened to her recount the visit. The police had gathered evidence, a date, a description that matched Andrew's account, boot prints, rope fibers, witness statements of a man in a suit seen near the crime scene. I realized they were closing in on the same details Andrew had casually shared in my office. In that instant, the dilemma crystallized into a brutal choice. Would I cooperate with law enforcement and hand over my destroyed records, knowing they were gone, or deny ever hearing those stories and let a murderer slip back into public life? I paced my empty office, the rotary clock ticking with deafening clarity. Each tick was a heartbeat of dread, reminding me that time was running out. That night, I found myself at my desk rifling through drawers, hunting for any backup of my notes, any stray audio files. But it was futile. I had obliterated everything. The adrenaline surge in my veins clashed with the crushing realization that my professional code had betrayed my duty to protect. Sleep eluded me. I replayed Andrew's words over and over. "Mine are quieter," he'd said, that cold certainty rolling off his tongue. The room felt too small, too confining, as if the walls themselves judged me. In the silence, I could almost hear the echo of distant screams, the rustle of leaves under a stranger's boots. My hands shook so badly that I feared leaving a fingerprint on anything. By morning, my ethical paralysis had reached a fever pitch. I was trapped between a rock and a hard place, therapist bound by confidentiality, and a citizen with a moral imperative. That tension defined the next few days. Torn phone calls with attorneys, sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, and frantic journaling where I tried to untangle right from wrong. But nothing resolved. Instead, the complexity deepened, and I understood that this was more than a clinical conundrum. It was a test of every boundary I believed in. And as the humid Virginia dawn broke over Alexandria, I faced the harsh truth that there was no simple solution, only choices that would haunt me forever. It was late October 2009 when everything came to a sudden, terrifying halt, when the carefully maintained walls of my professional detachment cracked, and I found myself staring straight into the abyss. I remember the afternoon clearly, the damp Virginia air pressed against the windows, muffling the distant hum of traffic and settling the office into a heavy hush. Senator Andrew Blake arrived 20 minutes early, uncharacteristically restless, pacing the hallway until I opened the door. His tailored suit looked immaculate, but his tie was loose, as if he'd tugged at it in frustration. I motioned him in, my pen poised above the empty line in my notebook that would record whatever he'd say next. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. Man, it was crazy how calm his voice sounded. He slid into the chair, eyes locked on mine with that same terrifying intensity I'd grown to dread. He began by referring to our last session in hushed tones, as though checking I remembered every detail. "That thing in Detroit," he said, voice low, "that's not mine. Mine are quieter." I felt the air in the room grow thick. My heart hammered so loud I thought he must hear it. I cleared my throat, trying to maintain my professional composure. "Andrew," I said slowly, "you know I take everything you share seriously. Why would you tell me those stories if they didn't mean something?" He leaned back, fingertips steepled in front of him, and gave me a faint, almost mocking smile. "Because, Doctor," he replied, "you never believed me." In that instant, the climax of our 8-year spiral hit me like a freight train. The realization that every account, every date, every chilling detail had been genuine, and that I had refused to acknowledge the truth, knifed through me with brutal clarity. My breathing caught. I wanted to stand, to scream, to rip up the floorboards and expose the horror beneath. Instead, I simply sat there, frozen, as he continued. He described another night, this time a college town in Ohio, March 22nd, 2007. So vivid I could almost see the flicker of the street lamp and smell the crisp fall air. He told it as though reading from my own notes, flipping through the pages I'd destroyed. I leaned forward, voice trembling despite myself. "Why are you telling me this now?" He shrugged, uncaring, amused. "To see if you'd finally understand," he said. "To see if you'd admit you knew." His words were a gauntlet thrown at my feet. Admit my complicity or remain silent. My mind raced. Report him now, destroy my own license, risk becoming the scandal of the century. Or walk away and let a murderer continue unchecked. The walls of the office felt like they were closing in, the plantation shutters casting long stripes of shadow across his face, splitting him into light and darkness. Then came the moment I'll never shake. He stood, placed a single white rose, pale and fragrant, on my desk and looked me dead in the eye. "You had your chance," he whispered, "but you chose the safe road." His tone held no malice, only stark certainty, as though I'd already failed him, and failed every potential victim. He turned and walked out, the click of his polished shoes echoing down the hallway like a final verdict. I watched the door swing shut behind him and felt the weight of that rose in my chest, a symbol of beauty turned poisonous by the truth it concealed. When the receptionist knocked softly, interrupting the silence, I could hardly form words. My voice was a rasp. "Cancel the rest of the day's appointments." She nodded, concern flickering in her eyes, but I was beyond consolation. I slid the rose into a glass of water and stared at it, thinking, I'll never forget that day. Not the confession, not the threat, but my own failure to act. It was the turning point that shattered my career, my peace of mind, and every certainty I'd ever clung to. And in that quiet, terrible moment, I understood that some confessions aren't cries for help, they're warnings, and ignoring them comes at a cost no therapist should ever bear. It took 3 long years before the world caught up with what my silence had set in motion. In the spring of 2012, detectives in Ohio connected evidence from 3 cold cases: a student strangled in Detroit, a young professional in Cleveland, and a graduate student in Columbus, only to discover the same unique boot prints, strands of rope, and a pattern of stalking behavior I had heard described in my office years earlier. Senator Andrew Blake was arrested in a late-night raid at his suburban home. The charges included multiple counts of first-degree murder, evidence tampered with, and obstruction of justice. By then, I had already shuttered my practice, destroyed my notes, and erased the audio recordings. So when investigators approached me for testimony, I was forced to confirm that I had no records. I remember sitting in a sterile interrogation room, heart pounding as I told them, in as calm a voice as I could muster, "I can't help you. There's nothing left." Their disappointment was palpable. I could see it in the detective's eyes when he said quietly, "Doctor, Morell, you may have had what we needed." In the months that followed, Blake's trial became a national spectacle. The prosecution called witnesses, a girlfriend who'd escaped his control, a forensic expert who analysed fibre evidence, and several detectives who pieced together the timeline. But they never had my notes or tapes to corroborate the vivid accounts he'd shared with me in confidence. Despite this, the jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The headline read, "Beloved Senator Exposed as Serial Killer," and for a moment, the world seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Yet I knew the full story behind those convictions remained hidden, a story I alone could tell but chose not to. As for me, I withdrew completely from public life. I moved out of Alexandria, leaving behind the brownstone that had been both my sanctuary and my prison. I bought a small cottage on the New Hampshire border, where the mountains rise like silent sentinels, and the only traffic sounds are the wind through the pines. I traded daily supervision meetings for long walks on gravel roads, and late-night seminars for evenings spent reading by lamplight. I never returned to therapy, couldn't face the clients whose secrets I once held, or to the journals I'd once filled with careful observations. Instead, I buried myself in volunteer work, helping at a local crisis hotline where confidentiality rules are strict, but the stakes rarely involve predators in tailored suits. Over the past decade, I've wrestled with the aftermath of my choice. I've faced angry letters from victims' families who wondered why a psychologist with 8 years of notes would suddenly vanish. I've received anonymous threats reminding me that my silence cost lives. I've also had moments of grace, reunions with former interns who tell me my mentorship gave them the courage to speak up when they encountered danger in their own practices. But the memory of that white rose on my desk, the chill of Andrew Blake's final confession, and the weight of the files I destroyed never leave me. Now, at 75, I speak only to this camera, to you, because some truths can't wait for justice or professional ethics to catch up. I'm not here to atone, nor to relitigate what happened in those sessions. I'm here to share the hard lesson I learned the day I chose self-preservation over protection. If someone tells you what they are, believe them. Confidentiality is essential, but it is not absolute when lives hang in the balance. If I could go back, if I could rewind the years to the moment he placed that rose on my desk, I would tear open the floorboards and scream the truth from the rafters. But I can't. So instead, I offer this account to anyone who might hesitate at a confession, who might weigh protocol over intuition. Trust your instincts and do what needs to be done, no matter the cost. Because silence can be the deadliest weapon of all. I still carry the weight of those years every day. After the trial ended and I'd watched Senator Blake led away in cuffs, I thought relief would wash over me. But instead, I felt hollow. I left Alexandria under cover of dawn, suitcase in hand, too ashamed to face my former colleagues or the neighbors who once waved as I strolled down King Street. In New Hampshire, the air is crisp and the hills unchanging, yet I couldn't shake the tremor in my hands nor the echo of his final confession. For months, I drifted through each morning, staring at my reflection and wondering if I could ever trust myself again. Did I fail because I lacked evidence or because I lacked courage? Over time, the ache in my chest softened into a dull throb, but it never disappeared. I learned to manage my guilt through small routines, a solitary walk at sunrise, a cup of tea steeped just so, and journaling, ironically, the very habit I once destroyed. I wrote about the sting of my professional code, the battle between confidentiality and conscience, and the faces of those I couldn't save. In those entries, my voice wavered between regret and resolve. I realized that the collapse of my career wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a reckoning with the limits of my training and the price of hesitation. As the years passed, my perspective shifted. I became less certain that every protocol is infallible and more convinced that empathy must sometimes override policy. I started mentoring young clinicians again, quietly encouraging them to speak up when something feels dangerously real. I share my story only with those who understand the stakes, reminding them that a therapist's greatest tool is not the DSM or a carefully worded intervention, but the willingness to act on intuition. Emotionally, I've grown both fragile and resilient. There are days when a sudden memory, his calm voice, the white rose, will catch me off guard, and I'll find myself holding my breath, bracing for a scream that never comes. Other times, I sit by my window watching the maple leaves turn gold and feel a quiet pride that, despite everything, I survived and learned from my mistake. My views on justice and mercy are forever altered. I no longer see them as opposing forces, but as dual obligations. To protect the vulnerable, but also to preserve my own integrity. Now, when someone asks how I feel about that chapter of my life, I answer honestly, I'm haunted, yes, but I'm also wiser. The aftertaste is bitter and sweet. Bitter for the lives I couldn't save, sweet for the clarity it granted me. And every morning I choose to believe in my instincts, I reclaim a piece of the person I almost lost. I learned that expertise and empathy alone aren't enough when the stakes are life and death. For years I trusted protocols, believing that confidentiality was absolute, and that evidence must always precede action. But what I truly carried away from my encounter with Senator Blake was the knowledge that intuition is a form of evidence too. That when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, you owe it to yourself and to others to listen. In the aftermath, I discovered that courage isn't a grand gesture, but a series of small choices. Choosing to speak up in a staff meeting when something feels off, flagging a concerning report rather than filing it away, trusting a patient's disclosure, even if it strains your sense of professional distance. My lesson isn't that rules are worthless, but that they must serve compassion, not replace it. I now see every standard form as an invitation to ask one more question, to probe deeper, to honor the quiet alarms we sometimes ignore. And I've carried that lesson into every conversation since, whether I'm volunteering on a crisis line or mentoring a nervous intern. Because if I could go back, I wouldn't change my discipline or my dedication. I'd simply learn to balance them with the fierceness of a sixth sense. In the end, the most vital skill I developed wasn't something I found in textbooks or clinical journals, but the bravery to believe what I heard when the truth came in a whisper. In the years that followed my forced retreat from private practice, my encounter with Senator Blake took on almost mythic proportions among the small circle of clinicians who knew the bare outline of my story. In professional conferences, I would occasionally hear whispers of the psychologist who lost her credentials to save a life, always with a mix of admiration and pity. Though I never spoke about the details, my silence became its own lesson, and younger psychologists would approach me, tentatively seeking guidance about navigating the tension between confidentiality and duty to warn. I found myself mentoring a handful of clinicians by correspondence, urging them to document every instinct, to consult ethics boards early, and to never assume a confession was metaphorical. Despite stepping away from one-on-one therapy, I never fully left the field of mental health. I contributed anonymously to training modules on risk assessment, sharing composite case studies that echoed my experience without naming names. Those materials, now used in doctoral programs, emphasize the importance of flagging red flag language, even when the patient frames it as fiction. I also volunteered regularly on a crisis hotline, where the stakes are lower but the lessons apply. Listen for the unsaid and trust when something doesn't feel right. In those calls, I practiced compassion unshackled by fear, reminding myself that acting, even imperfectly, can save lives. Over time, I realized that I never encountered another client quite like Blake. No one else combined the charisma of a public figure with the calculated cruelty of a predator. Yet I recognized in many patients the same glimmers of hidden truth, and I learned to lean into my discomfort rather than smooth it over. My approach shifted from purely analytic to instinct-driven. I taught myself to hold space for uneasy silences, to probe gently when a story seemed too precise to be fantasy, and to document every nuance in real time. Though most of my former colleagues have long since forgotten the specifics of my case, a few still reach out when they face similarly fraught ethical dilemmas. They tell me my story saved them from making the same mistake I did. In that indirect way, the legacy of those 8 years with Andrew Blake continues to shape practice standards, reminding a new generation of therapists that the bravest act can be speaking up when the truth arrives in whispers. As I sit here reflecting on all I've shared, I realize that the most haunting part of this story isn't the miles of erased transcripts or the headlines that followed Senator Blake's arrest. It's the simple fact that a confession slipped past me because I hesitated, and hesitation can cost more than time. Every day since, I've carried the echo of those whispers across my conscience, the soft description of violence, the unnerving precision of dates and places, the calm certainty in a powerful man's voice. I've come to understand that truth often arrives in fragments, in half-spoken sentences, or in details meant to feel like fiction. My plea to you isn't for sympathy or absolution. It's a challenge to listen harder, to trust your instincts even when professional rules and polite protocol tell you to stay silent. If you've ever ignored a gut feeling in favor of a more comfortable answer, you know the unease that follows. So I'll leave you with this. When you hear someone describe a dark impulse as a story, are you willing to ask the uncomfortable question, is this fiction or a confession, even if it risks shattering trust? Because sometimes the scariest moment isn't the monster behind the door, but the second you decide not to knock. What would you do if you found yourself holding a truth too dangerous to speak? Would you stay silent like I did, or find the courage to act? Let me know in the comments below.